You do mention a bunch of similarities, but at the same time I hear these stories and they also sound so different at the same time.
Sure.
And like, would you say like we can all lead this back to like common source? Like, is there something that, you know, leads to all of this, all these different stories?
Sure. Yeah. I think the main thing to remember in comparative religion and ancient Near Eastern studies is that we're looking at a people who were all living in the same region of the world during the same times, and so we shouldn't be surprised that we see peoples, even though they're of different nations, and we're not going to have like one-for-one similarities about everything. They're still viewing the world through very similar lenses. We have the same things happening today, like they call it Western thinking, or European thinking. Like in a place where people live in close proximity to one another, it could even be a radius of a few hundred or even thousands of miles. They have a similar outlook on life because they have a shared culture. And so when we look at the ancient Near East, yes, I personally, the more that I've learned about it, I'm not surprised to see that ancient Israel has similarities in their cultic practices to the Hittites or to the Canaanites or to even the Babylonians or the Assyrians or even the Egyptians, because it's all in the same proximity of Asia Minor. It's all in the same proximity of this region where people were dealing with not just the same proximity, but same ways of life, agriculture, these kinds of shepherding, they all shared these patterns of living. And so I would say the common source would be, again, the setting, what's called in Latin sitim leben, like the setting of what they lived in, the period of time in which they lived in, and just being human and having to deal with the same issues. Agriculture, building villages, kingship, monarchy, having to deal with death, sickness, animals, livestock, things like this. I
mean, that seems to make sense. And what I have heard before mentioned by a few professors that I've also had in university, and like they also mentioned these stories, right? Like also a few other stories like the flood and Epic of Gilgamesh, and like how they all kind of tell like a flood story. And they kind of make an argument that there are so many of these stories. Can any of these sources be really reliable if they're all so different?
That's a good question, and that is, as you say, a common way of thinking, not just about the flood story, but about all narratives per se. And when we look at the biblical narrative, when we look at Mesopotamian narratives, even with this research that we're talking about now with respect to like the festivals and calendars and cultic rituals, that the argument kind of is like one source because it's older, or one source because it's in this part of the world, and we say that it comes from an older language, that it's more reliable than the other. And I think, if I'm being honest, I think there's a tendency to lean towards a bias against the Bible in academia, and say because as far as like manuscripts are concerned, tangible manuscripts, our earliest manuscripts are the Dead Sea Scrolls, and they date to the 3rd century BC. As far as physical manuscripts go, narrative, of course, can have the potential to go back way later, like hundreds and hundreds of years later. And so when we compare physical manuscripts to like ancient tablets, for example, like the Enuma Elish, for example, these are clay tablets written in Akkadian that date to the physical tablets date to about the 9th century BC. They're way earlier. Just it is what it is. And that's the facts as far as the physical copies of the tablets or manuscripts are concerned. So because of that reason, there is I think a bias in academia that says, well, if this is earlier physically, and this narrative was floating around here in this empire that is earlier, then it's probably that the Bible borrows from this, or the Bible takes this story, and some will even go as far as saying like it's direct plagiarism. I don't agree with that notion. I think that, as I stated, even if the physical copies of manuscripts or tablets are concerned date later, the narrative has the potential to go even hundreds of years earlier, even thousands of years earlier. I mean, the date of Enuma Elish, for example, which is the Babylonian Creation epic. I talked about the Akitu festival.
Right.
We know a lot about the Akitu festival because of the Babylonian Creation epic. It's mentioned in there. The New Year festival, the Babylonian Creation epic, Enuma Elish is believed to have been recited during the Akitu festival, and it gives an account of the creation of the world from the Babylonian perspective, and it dated to the 9th century, but there are scholars who believe that it goes back as early as the 17th century BC to the Old Babylonian period, the time of Hammurabi. So just because our physical copies date to a certain time, it doesn't mean that the narrative, that the story can't go back much earlier.
Yeah.
And so as far as that goes, I think that we have to look at each narrative with the understanding that whenever we're talking about ancient history, whenever we're talking about writings, whenever we're talking about narratives and stories, we need to be honest with ourselves and say, this is what this story is claiming, and this is the physical copy that we have, and we know that at the latest it dates to this time, but it could potentially go back way earlier, and usually that's debated. But we should treat all sources like with fairness and with that understanding. And I don't necessarily know that just because one story may predate the other, it makes it more valid than the other story. We're simply just looking at a specific testimony or narrative through a specific people, right? The Babylonians have their version, the Assyrians have their version, the Canaanites from ancient Ugarit had their version. There are actually scholars, because there's a narrative that derives from ancient Canaan. I mentioned earlier the Baal cycle.
Yeah.
And it has the motif of Baal defeating the sea serpent or the sea monster Yam or Yamu, and this is a very common scene or battle throughout the ancient world. The same is in, I mentioned earlier, Babylon with Marduk fighting Tiamat, and the same is derived probably from Babylon, but the same is in Ashur with Ashur fighting Tiamat. And so Mesopotamia, there are some scholars who believe that the Mesopotamian serpent chaos battle story is actually derived from the West, from the Baal myth. And so it's I think a slippery slope when we get into the discussion of, well, who influenced who, which came first, which one is more credible than the other. So that would be my...
I see. And you mentioned that the Dead Sea Scrolls, they were written around like the 3rd century BC, but then you wouldn't argue that those are the first scrolls that have actually been written down.
No, absolutely not. No, nobody would argue that.
Okay.
No,
just making sure.
I was just simply saying those are the earliest copies, like physical copies we have.
I see.
Before that, it was scrolls that are actually much later, like the Aleppo Codex. Is considered some of the Masoretic texts that we have. The Leningrad Codex is actually the earliest full copy of the Hebrew Bible that we have. The Aleppo Codex is somewhat earlier, but it's not full. It's missing a lot of parts. But those dated to the Middle Ages, 9th century, 8th century AD. So when I say the Dead Sea Scrolls are the earliest physical copies that we have, that's what I mean, like the actual manuscripts. Yeah, which is why they're so important.
I see. Wow, that's fascinating. And you say copies, like, how do you figure that out, like that they are copies? Like you said, like most people agree that those are copies and that they have precedence, that there have been other versions before, but how do you figure that out? Like, how do you come to that conclusion?
As far as them being copies?
Yeah.
Yeah, well, I think when we have narrative tradition, we look at manuscripts and we can find that there are multiple copies of the same manuscripts. So we know that there are multiple copies of the certain fragments of the Dead Sea Scrolls. Even with the Enuma Elish, the tablets of the Enuma Elish, there are multiple copies of that. So the idea of a narrative being written just for one city, that's not the case. Like there would have been multiple copies made for dispersing to all the people, to the different cities, so that everybody would know. For in Babylon, the story of Marduk, that at least the scribes would know, the kings would know, and they would be able to disseminate that information to the common people. And so the same idea goes, I think, for ancient Israel. Like they had multiple copies of scrolls, of books, of writings, probably kept in the temple, and then much later kept in the synagogues. And it was up to the kings and the priests and the elite class who had access to these things to disseminate that information to the people.
Okay.
Yeah.
So it's kind of like what the monks did in the Middle Ages. They were basically like monks.
Right.
I see. Wow.
In fact, like that's how we view the community who lived at Qumran. Many scholars believe they were referred to as the Essenes because of different writings of Josephus, and but they were like monks basically.
Yeah. And you say many, but what do you believe?
I think that the Essene theory is probably the most likely. I think that we need to be careful though when we say that all the scrolls of the Judean desert were written by the Essenes, because there could have been different sects of this community who possibly, because Josephus talks about this pious community, he refers to them as the Essenes, and he says that they lived within the community and they were very, very pious and they were very religious. But then you know, he describes them as being very interactive and even living amongst the people. But then when we look at the actual writings of the Dead Sea Scrolls, the extra biblical writings, the community rule, for example, they're very sectarian in nature. They read like they don't want to interact with outsiders. They read like, this is our tight-knit community and you have to go through a lot of rites of passage just to be accepted. And so we should be careful when we just want to like generally categorize everyone together. I don't think that we should do that.
Wow.
It's like Judaism itself. With today we have what's referred to as Rabbinic Judaism, but there's other sects, Karaite Judaism, and even within Rabbinic Judaism you have different levels of orthodoxy, right? Confirmed Judaism, Reformed Judaism, and they all interpret the scriptures in a different way. Not entirely, but they practice it differently. And so within the late Second Temple period, it was the same, I would say. You had different sects. You had the Sadducees, the Pharisees, the sect at Qumran, the Essenes, who all viewed God, the commandments, the Word of God in their interpretive lens.
Wow, thank you so much for everything. I mean, I think that pretty much sums it up, but I want to thank you for coming, and I've really enjoyed this conversation. So I'd love to, you know, have another episode sometime. So.
I appreciate the time you've given me to share my research. Of course. And to get into all this stuff. It's been a pleasure.